All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3. This morning, we are delighted to welcome Professor Deen Freelon. Dr. Freelon is an associate professor at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina. And actually, in a month, he will actually become the Allen Randall Freelon Senior Professor of Communication here at the University of Pennsylvania in Annenberg School for Communication. Currently at the University of Carolina, Freelon is known for developing software tools that apply computational social science methods to questions about how ordinary people use digital media for political purposes, with a particular eye to how identity characteristics, particularly race, gender, and ideology, affect this technology use. His research, which has appeared in journals such as Nature, Science, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, deals with the issues including mis and disinformation, conspiracy theories, hyperpartisan content, ideological asymmetry, and personalized information environments. Today, he will be talking about studying the digital society in a post-API age. Please join me in welcoming Professor Freelon.
Thank you very much, Julia, and what's up, everybody? I'm very happy to be presenting here at SICSS. The last time that they allowed me to present here was in 2018 when it was at Duke, and it was very easy for me to get there. And so today I'll be talking about a topic that's actually quite similar to the one that I talked about then. I've given this presentation in a number of different versions, but I felt that it was especially germane to the data availability situation in which we find ourselves. And so this presentation is going to incorporate some elements that previous ones have, but I've revised it heavily to be more relevant to recent developments in the social media space regarding research. And so that's really what it's going to be. And I'm really looking forward to a nice and hearty Q&A that will incorporate a lot of your insights and what you've been seeing from the research that you've been conducting. So I have 2 goals in this talk. One of them will be problem identification. And if you've been paying any attention to what's been going on recently, I think that this one will be somewhat obvious, although I do hope to draw out some elements that are a little bit less obvious, even for those who have been paying close attention. So I'm going to do some problem identification first, and then I'm going to move on to something that is perhaps a bit less obvious, solution exploration. And specifically, what I want to do is take you through a little bit of my process, the way that I've been thinking about and approaching the contours of the stage that the post-API age has really hit. But I do want to emphasize that what I'm going to talk about is really highly individualistic, but at the same time is intended to provide an example of the kind of process that you yourself might go through if you've been heavily impacted by the developments that I'm going to be talking about in part 1. So I want that to be a bit of an exemplar, and perhaps you can, apprise me of some of the steps that you've gone through as you're thinking through what you're going to do about how things have been changing, especially if you work heavily with social media data. Let's get to it. So in 2018, I published this piece. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's called Computational Research in the Post-API Age, in which I define this notion of the post-API age, which is fundamentally, I don't know that it was new when I presented it, but I think that it's something that I just became kind of newly aware of at that time. And it didn't seem like there were a whole lot of other people talking about it, so I decided to give it a name, sort of a time-honored scholarly tradition there. And really what it is a state of data precarity, of uncertainty. So the data that you may be interested in analyzing, if it's social media data, may be here today and gone tomorrow, possibly. Maybe it'll be here tomorrow. Maybe it'll be gone day after tomorrow. The point is, you just don't know when it's going to happen. And so this piece, as short as it was intended to get people to think about how they would handle the sudden disappearance of data on which they previously relied. So if anything, the situation has become a lot more serious rather, now than it was when I wrote this. And so we'll be talking through some of the senses in which that's true as I move on. So I'm real proud of this particular visualization. I'm not a huge visual dude, but I think this is probably the high watermark of my visualization thing. So I reuse this a lot. But this is the 2018 version. You know what I'm saying? So this is, so what it says now, but think of yourself where you were in 2018, because that's kind of where we were. And so the idea being that the post API age, so you think about it also, similarly, for those of you who know what modernism and postmodernism are, does anybody really know? But one thing I do know about it is that, it's not okay, well, postmodernism started on such and such date. No, it's there's overlap, right? So as the API age ramps down, so does the post API age ramp up. And so at the time, in 2018, I posited that we were sort of in that middle period, that we were neither fully in the API age nor in the post API age, which of course implies that over time we would reach this sort of red zone of the post API age. Fast forward 5 years, and we are definitely in the red area at this point, given the developments that we've seen recently. And so we got to figure out what to do about it. I think at the time that I wrote the piece, it felt as though we had, a little bit more breathing room to think about how we were going to handle it. It's kind of whenever there's a problem that's kind of in the offing, you're kind of do I really want to think about it right now? I got a whole bunch of other things that are way more pressing, blah, blah, blah. Well, now we're in it. And so we don't really have any alternative than to think about what we're going to do when the data that we're relying on suddenly vanish before our eyes. So I like doing this post-API history thing, in part because I get to remind you all that I've been doing this for a very long time. But also just to sort of keep my own memory straight with all the wonderful things that used to be available to us that have fallen by the wayside over the years. So my little timeline here begins in March 2011. And people don't remember this, but prior to that time, Twitter's API did not require any kind of authentication, which was it. So in other words, you could just, walk up to the API, metaphorically speaking, and request your data quite easily, although it still was mostly programmatic. Actually, that's not true. There was a service at the time with a name that I actually find hard to get out of my mouth, which is Quapper Keeper, which basically allowed you to set up little keyword and hashtag listeners that would collect the data for you, no code required. And so this was before Twitter's terms of service actually required you to not to share the data. And so that service existed for a while, and then Twitter's terms of service changed and they had to shut it down. And that sort of began the regime of everybody having to have their own login credentials and nobody being allowed to share data. Now, of course, did it happen? Yes, but officially you were not allowed to do that. Then in April of 2015, Facebook, people don't remember this, Facebook used to have a search API very similar to Twitter's. And so within a rolling 2-week window, you used to be able to look for anything that was basically public, whether it was on somebody's timeline or on a page or in a group or whatever. You could do that with a keyword search, but Facebook took that away in 2015, unfortunately. Then in December of 2015, there used to be this service called Topsy, which was a third-party Twitter data broker, but it was purchased rather by Apple and shut down in December 2015. And that was at the time that Twitter brought all of its data sales in-house with its purchase of the company GNIP, which handles most of its data sales, or all of it, I think. And then, of course, there was the incidents that I talk about in the post-API piece, which occurred in April 2018. specifically the functional elimination of Facebook's pages and groups API, which provided post and comment data for public pages. This had been used by a number of researchers and was a really big blow to people who study Facebook. That same month, they eliminated, or Meta rather, eliminated key pieces of Instagram's API, rate limiting the remaining pieces. And this was all in response to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which had used some of these APIs to be able to, commit its ethically problematic deeds. And so, in some ways, the research community were collateral damage in that. And so this kicked off a 2-year period in which it was essentially impossible, I think, to obtain Facebook programmatic data without violating its terms of service. And so it was a tough time for people interested in Facebook and metadata, meta space data. So I got a little part 2 here. In May 2018, the GDPR takes effect. Now, I'm not an expert in the GDPR. It's not super relevant to me since I don't live in Europe. But as I understand it, it explicitly allows research-related exceptions for data access and analysis, which is really great if you do your research in Europe. You have to consult with an expert about that, of which I am not. In July 2020, Facebook began allowing university researchers to apply for access to CrowdTangle, which sort of ended that period of not being able to access Meta's data in a terms of service compliant way. And so that was really nice. CrowdTangle is somewhat of an incomplete solution. It didn't completely replicate the functionality of the old Pages API. In particular, you were limited to pages and groups of above a certain popularity, like I think of over like 1,000 users or something like that. And also it doesn't allow you to collect comments, which is kind of annoying. In January 2021, some of you may be aware of this as we're getting closer to the current day, Twitter opened its academic product track for university researchers, which is really great. It was free. You got 10 million tweets per month. Actually was part of the university team that they consulted as they were developing this, which was really nice. And so, yeah, for 2 years, it was great. But unfortunately, in February 2023, Twitter announced the end of free API access, which it had provided almost since the beginning, which obviously threw a number of research plans into disarray. And so even though it took them a while to sort of shut it all the way down, it was really just the writing was on the wall at that point. And people needed to figure out exactly how they were going to handle this. So this is one of the major developments to which this presentation is a reaction and a solicitation for suggestions. In February 2023, also same month, TikTok released a research API, which among other things requires continuous local sync. And so what that means is that if you collect data from the TikTok API, you are agreeing to sync up your local data collection with whatever is available through the TikTok API for 15 days. And so technically that's not the easiest thing to do. It's not impossible, but the bigger problem with it is that it's a highly fault-prone process. So like if your computer, the server that you're running this on shuts down or reboots or crashes or something, that could basically break that whole process. And so it's a bit of a brittle thing. And so it really is a bit onerous for people who are trying to study this if they want to remain entirely terms of service compliant. They also ask you to swear up and down in writing that you're doing it. So, that's fun too. And then just last month, Reddit removed access to PushShift. If you've done Reddit research, you've heard of this. This is a service that many researchers and others use to collect Reddit data. And so removing access to it makes Reddit data a lot harder to access. Reddit has also said that they're going to start charging for their API data. I'm not sure whether they have any pricing tiers up. I have seen examples of some other non-research tools that have been dependent on Reddit data saying that those specific pricing options that they've been offered have not really been, something that they can afford. So if they have academic tier pricing, I have not seen that yet. Okay, so a few post API trends here. These are just, obviously, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. I don't know why that thing is right in front of my thing, but that's kind of irritating. Anyway, it says post API trends. Anyway, so yeah, I'm happy to talk through it. I don't need to be right in front of this. People tell me I have a loud voice and I can project pretty well. So anyway, one of the trends is service removal. And so the service of authentication-free APIs has been removed. This is certainly true of Twitter. Facebook search and page APIs, as I mentioned, Twitter's academic API haven't gone away. Another one that I think is somewhat underappreciated is the ability to search Twitter while logged out. And this is something that was used by open source Twitter data collection tools, including Twint and SN Scrape, which were disabled by the end of this particular functionality. And so these technical changes are making it harder and harder to monitor what's going on these various social media tools, even outside of the availability of the official APIs. Second trend is going fee only or fee mostly. So technically, there still is a free version of the Twitter API. Unfortunately, it only allows for posting something like 100 tweets a month or something, and it doesn't allow for any data collection. And so Twitter is certainly going that way. Reddit, as I mentioned, has also announced that they're going to start charging for their data at some point. And so that's they may provide some kind of free tier. Another thing that happens with the fee only or fee mostly situation is that in many cases, the fees that they charge are quite exorbitant and are not really within the budget of most academics. And so that's another thing we got to deal with. And then the last one is one that I mentioned in reference to TikTok, and I refer to that as onerous terms of service. So even when you can get the data, a lot of times what they're asking you to do to be terms of service compliant are actually quite, it adds a lot more work. In addition to the analytical work you have to do, the data maintenance work can be quite onerous, including TikTok's API sync, as well as something that hit the news a week or two ago, which is data expiration. And so technically, if you buy data from Twitter, there's a time after which they ask you to delete it. That's long been a part of their GNIP terms of service. As somebody who's purchased data from GNIP on multiple occasions, I can tell you they've never actually tried to enforce that, at least with me. But they recently announced that they were going to try to do this with people who had purchased Twitter data through the Decahose. I'm not sure whether they're going to try to enforce that on people who collected data through the academic API, but technically it's within their rights to do so. And of course, as I mentioned, with the post-API age, any of this stuff can happen at any time. And so it's really good to know that these things are at least potentially in the offing in case they ever should happen to come to light. Talk a little about new entrants, right? So people, if you were on Twitter around the time Musk took over, there were a lot of people who were like, I'm leaving. I am out of here, off to greener pastures, perhaps. And some people have actually made good on this particular, I don't want to call it a threat, promise, let's call it. And they've left Twitter to go elsewhere. By far, the largest of the new, well, not really that new, newly salient entrants is Mastodon, which as of March 23 had over 10 million users in an API. But of course, because Mastodon is federated, everyone who runs each instance can control which aspects of the API they turn on and off, which is a totally different regime than Twitter and other centrally organized platforms offer. And one which I think will present a particular difficulty for people who want to study Mastodon. The others are much, much smaller. You can see Post is just over 100,000, same for Spoutable. These numbers have not been independently audited, or they've been stated by the people who design these platforms. And so this could be the total number of accounts. I don't think they're not necessarily talking about monthly active users or anything like this. You can see that the API presence is scattered to unknown. Some folks have said, oh, well, we got a forthcoming. Others, I couldn't find any information about whether APIs actually exist. But when I look at this chart, I think of something that was once said by the media theorist Clay Shirky, which is that technologies don't become politically interesting until they become technologically boring. And I would submit to you that none of these have become technologically boring yet. They might at some point, especially if Twitter continues down its downward spiral, but we're not there yet. And so until they hit that point, I think that their value, at least from in terms of what I study, which is political communication, will be somewhat limited. I think we're also looking at something of a retreat from the public. This is certainly something we've seen in the activist space, which I've studied directly. But you know, a number of this, we all know that a lot of very interesting and valuable communication occurs on private messaging apps like Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, iMessage, Facebook Messenger, you know, DMs, and that sort of thing. These platforms, you know, are both ethically and, you know, technically, logistically difficult to investigate, but they do hold relevance for the study of topics. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch. Political communication, you know, misinformation, disinformation, infodemic, whatever you want to call it, relationship communication, fandom, all sorts of different things. And so I don't think that we have, unless this has happened without my knowledge, I'm not sure that folks have come up with a good and replicable paradigm to be able to do this because of the ethical difficulties of studying these sorts of private spaces. But the little research that we have seen, at least in the misinformation, disinformation, infodemic space, does suggest that there's a lot of that content going on in here, perhaps more so than on the public spaces where you can have fact checking and terms of service that remove this content when it pops up. Something else we got to deal with. So let me just summarize a few of these problems, take stock for a minute. So the data we're interested in are held by private companies and/or end users, as opposed to generated by researchers or held by public authorities, as is the case with survey data, experimental data, and census data, to name a few. Access to these data is always provisional, limited in scale, scope, and time, and may be revoked at any time without warning. Those are just facts. And that's the world we live in. Access can be expensive, sometimes prohibitively so. And so even among institutions that can afford these kinds of data, that means that there is sort of somewhat of a digital divide, money divide really, between the institutions and the individuals who can afford it and those who cannot. Finally, and I can speak with personal experience on this particular point, developing software to collect such data can be a frustrating enterprise as the risk of obsolescence is constant. I developed several programs that changes to the API or changes to the data service have rendered partially or fully obsolete. But that's only because I can't help myself. I've been doing this for many, many years, and I seem not to have learned that lesson. And so I got to say, it's not something I would recommend, but if you're like me and you can't help yourself, clearly nothing I say is going to make a difference anyway, but I figured I would just put it out there regardless. So what do we do? So here's the part where I'm going to switch into the solution aspect of this and provide a demonstration of my thought process in the hopes that it may help you in your individual process. And again, this is what I'm going to talk about is individual to me, but also should stand as an exemplar of the kind of thing that you should be doing if you're interested in digital communication data. So firstly, like redefine, a better word I guess would be like revisit. So revisit your research area, fundamentally ask yourself, what am I really interested in? My guess is that for most of you, that will not necessarily be a particular platform. If it is, I got some bad news for you. But if your interest is something like, oh, well, so this particular social phenomenon, like, or this particular dynamic, or even this group of people, right? Then I think you've got some options. Then after that, you want to figure out what data sources can help you answer your questions about your area. And of course, the goal here is to avoid putting all of your eggs in one basket. This is an idiom that I use a lot. Basically, the eggs in this metaphor are your research interests and, you know, time and effort and, you know, work and all that stuff. And the basket is the platform that you're studying. So a number of researchers, including myself, have been putting way too many eggs into the Twitter basket. And so we are definitely reaping the, you know, consequences of that. And now we have an opportunity in sort of a silver lining moment to reconsider how we do business. And I think that it's a really good idea to do so. So let me give you this personal example. This is a segment or a screenshot of my Google Scholar profile, which helpfully lists the research interests that I present to the world, including political communication, open source, identity politics. This is not, again, not an exhaustive list. Identity politics, computational social science, and social media. So, if I needed a reminder of what my own research interests are, it's right there, so I never forget. But this is something that I can then think about, okay, so what other platforms and data sources can I use to study these particular topics, especially the ones that are not specifically technical? So those would be political communication, and identity politics, and to some extent social media. And so that sort of is where I start from. And I'm looking around for other sources of data that will allow me to continue my work, along similar lines as as an outgrowth of the work that I've already done. So I personally find it really helpful to break these sorts of things down by like pros and cons. This is a very helpful kind of analytical, personal tool for me. So I can think about the pros and cons of the platforms that I've had some experience with, specifically Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit. So obviously, the pros of something like Twitter is I have a lot of experience with it. I've sunk countless hours into analyzing Twitter data. I don't really keep track, and I'm glad I don't, because it's been a lot. Obviously, it's politically relevant, right? So if you look at the number of people, members of Congress, folks in government, journalists on there, they're all on there. So from a political standpoint, it's quite relevant. There's a sizable and diverse user base. It's not quite as large as Facebook or Instagram, but it is pretty large. And so a lot of different people on there. Cons, not as big as Facebook or Instagram, which is well known. The biggest con is that the data are now prohibitively expensive, which sort of forces my hand. And so my decision there is that I'm shifting away from Twitter analysis, at least pending an acceptable research paradigm, which doesn't exist at this time. Next up, Facebook and Instagram. So both of them individually are bigger than Twitter. They're politically relevant. I'd say this applies probably more so to Facebook than Instagram. Instagram's the fact that Instagram doesn't really allow you to post links, I think, limits the political relevance to some extent. I have some experience, less so than I have with Twitter, but some experience with Facebook and Instagram data. On the con side, Instagram doesn't really allow links. I just mentioned that. CrowdTangle only offers data sets for large pages and groups and doesn't allow analysis of comments, which is kind of irritating. Also, it's been widely reported that CrowdTangle may be on its last legs. I checked a couple of months ago, it still is out there, but again, post API age, we wake up tomorrow and then gone. So that's something that I really don't want to put a whole lot of eggs in that particular basket for that reason. Now, again, I really hope it doesn't go away, but if it does, that is going to, I think, raise very similar challenges to the ones we're currently facing with Twitter. And so, again, my decision there is to shift away from that. And then finally, at the bottom, we've got Reddit. Reddit does have a substantial user base and quite rich metadata, including lots of interesting metadata that are not available for the two preceding platforms. It's politically relevant, a lot of political discussions on there. Cons, possibly prohibitively expensive based on some of the quotes that I've seen floating around out there. Another issue for me personally, when I think about political communication, there are very few journalism and political elites that use it. Typically, these are sort of ordinary or non-elite users, but you don't have a lot of folks from Congress or major celebrities or journalists on there. So it doesn't quite have the same political impact as Twitter did. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm probably going to be moving away from Reddit as well. Now, so let's talk about something I'm going to be moving a little bit towards. So YouTube, right? People forget sometimes that YouTube is the second most popular platform in the United States after Facebook. Lots of political content. YouTubers can earn money on the platform in ways that they can't through Facebook and Twitter. YouTube's API is still free and still very useful. Of course, the cons here include the fact that analyzing video at scale is quite difficult. Robust analysis will require the development of new software. But that having been said, I feel like This is a challenge I'm very interested in taking on, so I'm going to move toward it, focusing on political talk videos, which I think minimize some of the drawbacks of studying political video. So that'll be something that I'll be looking at doing in the future. TikTok is actually quite similar. It's rising rapidly in popularity. They just announced a new and free research API, as I mentioned earlier. It's quite politically relevant, again, in ways that are similar to YouTube, although I think that the user base is a little bit younger, so you get a little bit of a sort of youth politics going on there. Again, analyzing video scale is difficult, same as YouTube. The API's terms of service are onerous, as I mentioned earlier, and unfortunately, TikTok is becoming banned in some U.S. jurisdictions, including Montana, and at certain state universities, including the one I'm currently at. Although technically, I just checked and I can still access TikTok through my university-issued laptop, which means they haven't worked out all the technical details yet, but I'm not officially supposed to be doing so, according to the governor. But again, I'll be shifting toward that again, political talk videos. I think the pros outweigh the cons in this case. Finally, podcasts, right? These are rising in popularity, similar to TikTok, a lot of political content, quite easy to obtain programmatically, and there are a lot of different sort of sources of this where you can get it from. Analyzing audio at scale can be difficult for the same reasons as video, requires new software, blah, blah, blah. And again, because the challenges are somewhat similar, I'm going to try to move toward this one as well. So that's sort of how my cost benefit analysis sort of breaks down for these particular options. So this is just a real quick look at some of the top providers of programming for YouTube and TikTok. So in the background to the left is the top 5 news and politics TikTok providers, including those are YouTube providers rather, including Vice, The Richest, which I've never heard of, ABC News, Inside Edition, and the pop singer Halsey for some reason. I'm not sure how much politics she talks about, but could be a false positive. I don't know. I just found this real quick and put it on the slide. Didn't do a whole lot of fact checking on this one, but it seems like it generally is kind of the correct thing. But the point is, before I actually do any real research on this, I'll probably look at it a bit harder. And then in the lower right-hand corner, this is just a real quick look at the hashtag politics from TikTok. You can see that there are 36.6 billion views. Obviously, this is not geographically limited. It includes politics from anywhere in the world, but it does go to show that there is a substantial interest in politics on TikTok. A lot of really interesting content to be analyzed and presented. So getting into that, I think, will be a really interesting challenge in the years ahead. And then this last one is from Spotify. And so this shows the top Spotify political podcasts, which include providers such as the New York Times, NPR, the Daily Wire, and the Wall Street Journal. And so also quite analytically interesting and likely to provide some nice comparative points to the politics content on the 2 preceding platforms. So let's think through this. So as somebody who is approaching a data source with which I am not super familiar, I thought it would be interesting to think about some of the characteristics of political video and audio content. So they're very different from social media in terms of their data structure. They're much denser, right, than on a per unit of analysis basis than a tweet or a social media message would be. It's natively audio, which requires conversion and speaker identification, which I'll provide a demo of in just a minute. And then the visual aspect, at least as far as political talk videos and podcasts, well, political talk videos, less so podcasts, because there is no visual audio element. But for political talk videos, the visual aspect is much less important. You think about talking heads, right? So if you can see people, that's great. But you can get a vast majority of what's really interesting about this just by looking at the audio aspect. Also, generally, this content is going to be a lot less social. The general dynamic is much more similar to top-down legacy media, right? So there's an on-demand element of it, but you have the paradigm of people providing content that other folks then consume, and the interaction element is not quite as robust as you get in more traditional social media spaces. This space is dominated by elites, probably even more so than traditional social media, many of whom are well known from the mainstream media, as I showed on previous slides. I have a strong suspicion that there's probably less engagement between content producers and the audience. in part due to that elite domination, but that, of course, is an empirical question. And finally, there are higher barriers to entry, in part because there is an expectation of very strong production values, particularly when it comes to political video, but also with podcasts, right? You know, you're not going to reach the top unless you've got really nice editing and, you know, some like nice background music, and, you know, voice quality sounds pretty good. You know, it's not the kind of thing you can just pull out, you know, the voice memos app and, you know, automatically shoot to the top of the charts. There are certain expectations there that require money, and that certain media concerns are best positioned to produce. So a number of analytical challenges here that I'm going to talk about. One is that is a speech-to-text transcription accuracy. So traditionally, transcription was done by humans, but recent advances in AI have really increased the accuracy of that. And again, I'll demonstrate that in a minute, removing a key technical barrier preventing mass analyses of recorded speech. And so that's really, really great. So we've reached a point technologically where this kind of thing is really becoming a possibility, which is great. Accuracy depends on a number of factors, including things like English language proficiency of the speaker, accents, recording quality, the presence of background music, all that sort of thing. Best tools don't come free, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. Then, of course, there's this issue of speaker identification. Ideally, a researcher would want to know who's speaking. On official transcripts, which are provided by some data providers like Nexus Uni and a few others, the names of the people who are speaking are provided in the transcript, similarly to what you might get in a script for a movie. But automated systems are not quite as good at that. Some programs apparently attempt to do this. I haven't tested those. The thing that I'm going to show you in a little bit actually does not do that. And then the last piece that I'll talk about on this slide is linking audio data with textual metadata will be really important, including comments if those are available, ratings, likes, and other content, to be able to get some aspect of a social dynamic between the provision of the audio and visual content and the people that are actually engaging with it and who have something to say in response. But those are two very different data sets. And so the combination of that is, at least at first, not necessarily a trivial enterprise there. There are also some non-analytical challenges, including things like audio codec compatibility, right? So, you know, the audio codecs that are supported by the particular conversion systems, you have to be paying attention to what those are. In most cases, the audio format must first be converted to a format supported by the transcription app. For video, that means the audio tracks must be extracted first, which adds another layer onto your research pipeline. Then, of course, there's pricing. So the good speech-to-text APIs are not free, as I mentioned. Google Cloud, for example, charges 1.2 cents per minute. That works out to about exactly 72 cents per hour. So to put that in context, Joe Rogan, who is a podcaster of some renown, I'm told, has produced roughly 5,789 hours. This is actually accurate as of yesterday. Joe Rogan has a lot of fans who apparently have a lot of free time on their hands. So they calculated this. So you put the math together, and that's going to cost you $4,168.08 to transcribe it all. So if you want the entire Joe Rogan archive transcribed, that's how much it's going to cost you using the Google Cloud's pricing. And that's just one podcast. So you multiply that times the number of podcasts you're interested in, and you start to get some idea of the amount of money that this is going to cost. But of course, that's way cheaper than paying an actual transcriptionist to do that. But it certainly is something that anybody who is attempting to undertake this should be aware of at the outset. So I'm going to give you a real quick example. Originally, I was going to try to run this code for you, live, but I'm not going to try to do that because I don't know whether this thing has the correct version of Python installed. Also, it requires JSON authentication and blah, blah, blah. Point is, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to show you the output. This is just something I whipped together in a couple of hours yesterday. And the purpose of it is to take a YouTube video and spit out a transcript. That's really all it does. So it's got a bunch of options, but the main one is that the YT one there at line 14. So you stick your YouTube URL in there, it does a bunch of stuff, and then it gives you a transcript out, and again, this is just a toy example, but I wanted to be able to show this just as a very, very basic proof of concept. And what I'll do is I will, I'm going to put up this, we're going to see if this works. I'm going to put up this YouTube video that I have. So this is from a very different political time. This is from one of the 2012 debates. This is Mitt Romney doing the binders full of women, thing. You may remember this from about 11 years ago. So I'm going to play this. Now, I'm not going to show the video, but you'll be able to hear the audio. You can just like mentally imagine like Mitt Romney ambling around the stage as he's doing this. But I'm also going to put on the actual transcript, which is the one that I generated yesterday from this. And so I want you to listen to the video as you are reading the transcript so that you can assess the quality of the auto transcription. This is using Google Cloud. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this.
Governor Romney, pay equity for women.
Thank you, and important topic, and one which I learned a great deal about, particularly as I was serving as governor of my state, because I had the chance to pull together a cabinet, and all the applicants seemed to be men. And I went to my staff and I said, how come all the people for these jobs are all men? They said, well, these are the people that have the qualifications. And I said, well, gosh, can't we find some women that are also qualified? And so we took a concerted effort to go out and find women who had backgrounds that could be qualified to become members of our cabinet. I went to a number of women's groups and said, can you help us find folks? And they brought us whole binders full of women. I was proud of the fact that after I staffed my cabinet and my senior staff, that the University of New York in Albany did a survey of all 50 states and concluded that mine had more women in senior leadership positions than any other state in America. All
right, there we go. So I don't know how closely you're following that, but I thought that was pretty good insofar as the quality of that. Oh gosh, quiet down, please. So yes, auto things continue. Anyway, so I thought the quality of that transcription was pretty good. The one thing I didn't love about it was that it didn't differentiate speakers. But in that case, it didn't really matter that much because the vast majority, except for the very beginning, was only done by one person. And so this is as I'm evaluating this, there were a number of speech-to-text APIs that are out there. This is the job that Google Cloud did, which I thought was pretty good. And so there's some things. Also, this is not entirely accurate. This is from a different version. This is actually accurate for a different version of Google's speech-to-text API, which has trouble evaluating an entire file, which is irritating. But it did actually transcribe the entire file, which is great. It didn't skip anything, which is really nice. The maximum file size, again, that's from the other one. But this particular API does have a limit of 1 minute, which is kind of annoying. So, again, to example, there are ways to get around that, but it required a little bit more time to investigate than I had, but also I didn't really have time for you to listen to something really long anyway, so it ended up working out. And of course, no speaker ID was true as well for both of these. So all these technical details are really, really important to be able to work out. But at least as far as the quality of the transcription goes, I thought that example was pretty good. I was satisfied with that quality. So thinking about moving toward a more stable digital research paradigm, we see that our eggs, metaphorically, are distributed among many baskets. And so this is just one example. And so thinking about this in terms of having and researching different platforms, so that if one goes away or the API goes away, that you still have other options that are available to you. Sounds obvious, and yet. So something else that's very important for me to emphasize and to reiterate, the code is reusable. Certain aspects of that will apply to whatever kinds of transcriptions I want to be able to do, which is really nice. And then, of course, I'm exploring important data that have long been overlooked due to the predominance of Twitter in the social science space. And this is something that I think we are long past due in terms of moving beyond. And this is, again, some people have been doing this. I think a lot of folks have been. But I think the entire field is really going to be forced to be doing this as we move forward. So again, you should think about doing this if you find yourself at a transition point with your data. I'd recommend going through a similar process. Given how quickly data access policies change, generally speaking, we need to be nimble and creative in identifying new and useful data sources. And of course, I think this has been somewhat implicit throughout this presentation. Computational skills will be essential to produce software and techniques for collecting, pre-processing, analyzing, and visualizing data from these new sources. It's part of why I wanted to talk to you all about this. So now I want to give you a pitch for a conference that I am going to be leading or co-organizing that's going to happen in October, right around the corner at the Annenberg Public Policy Center here on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. I'm co-organizing this with Joe Lakito at Austin, Bree McEwen at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Josh Pasek at the University of Michigan. And so we are going to be talking about all of this much more in depth and more conversationally. And so we've got 4 themes we're going to be talking about: gaps, education, storage and access, and ethics. And so we're going to have submissions that are going to be lightning talks, not full papers. And so the idea is to sort of make this low effort, well, high thought, low effort, I guess. But not that you would have to produce something, fully fleshed out. We want very basic ideas that we can share and develop in a conversational atmosphere, so we can figure out and decide on the best ways to get around this and things that really don't work as well. So we can avoid making those kinds of wasting our time in those sorts of ways. And so this is something that I would encourage you all to apply to, especially if you live anywhere close to here. But we also have some travel funds, which is also actually on the next slide. Anyway, submission deadline is Monday, July 17th. Conference date is Sunday, October 22nd, which is Sunday. And then we're trying to foster connections and solutions. 1-page lightning talk submission, as I mentioned. No submission is necessary to attend, but those who do submit will receive admission preference. I think we're going to try to cap it at around 75 or 80, just based on the needs of that particular room. We have a couple of intended outcomes here. So we want to create a wiki of resources that are surfaced within this conference, and also to publish the major conclusions from each session in sort of a press release format, so the folks who weren't able to come will be able to get the main points, as a partial solution to doing a hybrid conference, which is something that I am not a huge fan of. So the CFP link is here. Submission form is below that. If you want to email us, we have an email address that's devoted specifically to this conference. There is limited travel funding available for grad students, contingent faculty, and independent scholars. And so if you are interested in that, please do indicate as much on your submission form, and we'll try to work with you as much as we can. We need to figure out how many people really want this, where they're coming from, so we can figure out how to allocate the money that we have available to us as equitably as possible. So I'm happy to return to this. The next slide is just some personal information of mine, but I'm going to probably come back to this if folks are interested. At this point, I'm going to stop talking and allow you to respond. And I'm very interested in your perspectives on this. So thank you. Yes.
One chapter using Twitter data to look at attitudes geographically. I managed to collect the data under the wire, inside about 2 million tweets. But this pivoting away, being like mentioning that Twitter can request that you delete all of it. Wondering what does that look like for someone like me that I do have the data and I have a planned project, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, Elon Musk has proven somewhat mercurial, if that's a word we can use, among other words, in terms of making these kinds of decisions at the drop of a hat. And so I can't tell you whether he's going to make that demand. Honestly, if it were me, but again, it's also hard too because I have tenure and but if it were me, I would recommend that people just go ahead and do your research, honestly, because, you think about it, imagine if there were some, directive of this nature that comes down, like when it's in the review process or something like that, all the data are already crunched, there's nothing you can really do about it at that point. I think over the long term, this is an issue that's going to resolve itself. And so, and also the other thing that I remind myself of is that The cost of legal action is actually quite high for most of the companies that do this, and so the odds that you'll be like sued or anything are pretty low. At least historically, that's been the case. And so I think if you do have access to this and you've acquired your data under pre-existing data agreements, I would just go ahead and do it, because I think it's something that it seems to be, at least as far as if history is any guide, nothing too bad will happen to you. Of course, there are no guarantees.
Does that mean that there's different data collection there?
So that remains to be seen, I think, because there's, again, I'm not an expert on the GDPR. There are certain provisions within it that explicitly allow for research, but it'll be really interesting. But the shuttering of the API is a technical matter, which means that if it goes away, it becomes inaccessible to everyone. And so I'm not aware of any situation in which people in certain jurisdictions have access to it and others don't. So my understanding, at least as far as Twitter goes, is that this is something that affects everyone who might make use of it. And so until we see otherwise, that's kind of, I think that's the way things are. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks, Bruce. So the methods we use is often contingent on the data we have. In my mind, maybe wrong, but network analysis is pretty dominant, partially because of the data that we had following lists and whatnot.
Yep.
I think that'll still be the case. Budding social scientists, is it a better idea to go, focus on like Texas data?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think of Texas data as a sort of very large umbrella term, which indicates that you could use a number of methods that could be applied to it. So a good example of this would be something like a semantic network, right? So the idea, one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea of particular, I guess you could call them named entities. So these would be places, people, institutions that link together people who engage in the industrial production of falsehood, right? So in other words, if there are certain, like, you think about somebody like Bill Gates, George Soros, Hunter Biden, right? People that are disproportionately discussed by folks that are really, dedicated to spreading conspiracy theories, baseless allegations, these sorts of things, bound together by the extent to which the density with which they discuss these is something to be modeled as a network. Then you look at other sources that are engaged in the production of quality content, right? Reputable journalists and the like, who very rarely mention these individuals. And so the question of I think you do have a point when you talk about the inherently relational aspects of certain social media data, but I think that do I see network analysis becoming irrelevant in the future? No. I think it has a lot to tell us about what's really interesting and going on. You think about something like people who are within a podcast network. If you could visualize the different podcasts that they individually subscribe to, this would require data collection of a type that I haven't figured out yet, but is at least theoretically possible, right? So yeah, I think we need to get a little bit creative, but no, I think if you're studying network analysis, there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah. Yes. That's funny. Doomsday prepping for this. Gosh, as far as Reddit goes, no, the Reddit announcement, as I understand it, was somewhat sudden, right? So I don't know that there was too much advance notice about that. Really, I know that the guy who created Push Shift actually has a lot of the data. I think he's collected it himself. So the largest repository of Reddit data, I think, rests with the guy's name is Jason Baumgartner. So I think he's got it. But I think that unless I could have missed this, probably because of paying too much attention to Twitter data, but I don't think that there was too much indication that this is going to happen. Like when Musk took over Twitter, I think I said at the time, or maybe I just told some colleagues, or it might all have been in my head, but I thought, wow, there could be very well a situation in which the API goes away, right? When he's cutting, all the staff positions and all of that kind of stuff. And so my thought was, well, the API's days may be limited, and of course they were. But as far as Reddit goes, at least I didn't see any advance warning of that. And so I think really the main person who would have that data would be Jason. Yeah.
All questions. The research, what the best way to navigate the space, how to get shared data. Like, let's say there's a researcher who CNO has a large repository of this information. I'm interested in the subset of that data. With the red tape that surrounds that type of information. What type of like model or solution would be the best way to go about that?
You can come to our conference. We'll be talking all about this at the Post API conference, right? So I can't give you a full answer to that right now. I can tell you that one of the things, so you need to take account of a number of different considerations. One of them would be the various terms of service of the different data providers. Another would be the cost involved. A third one would be complying with university data policies. And so it may be a situation where we have to come together and work toward new data consortia. But again, there's a lot of red tape to be worked out. Thinking about a membership model in terms of who's a member, who's not, how do you become a member, how do you contribute to something like this? And then of course, which data platforms and services are included. Again, not something I can give a full answer to now, but we will be talking about this a lot at our conference in October. Yes.
You mentioned TikTok's API.
Yep.
Having all these pre-complicated risks. They're kind of modeled off of YouTube research API program and Facebook's board offering. That is my understanding. Do you give any hope for those? Like, is there any chance that Facebook's research API is going to have any equalizer that's there's like trap to put up to the exit?
We have used Fort. It's useful for a very specific tasks. So Fort, for example, doesn't surface any individual user data, which is kind of annoying. Which you can get interesting, aggregate data through that. So in other words, the data content are actually quite different than what you would get from CrowdTangle or through the former Twitter API. And so, again, I think it really depends on what your research questions are. Obviously, I wouldn't only do that, but if you've got questions that I think fit the contours of those data very well, then you might very well do that. I think the general answer here is that whenever you're trying to interface with any particular data platform, there is always going to be the risk. This is the whole post API logic. There's always going to be the risk that it could go away. And so there's always like a little bit of faith there, that it'll last long enough for you to be able to do your research. And that's just how things are, if you really have a problem with that, then you probably should go, do some surveys or some experiments or things like this, where you have more control over all of the research protocols and the materials and the data and everything. But because we're relying on these external sources, we have to get comfortable with the fact that they can be taken away at any time. And that's just kind of how things are. Yes.
I guess one was it made me think about it. Yeah.
Yep.
And line of conversation for wow.
Yep. Yep.
Right. And so I guess what I'm wondering is some of these technology is like whether you're researching importing data like into those tools or you're taking the data from those tools and like own that. But I guess it's it's a matter of like once you're going to publish something, right? Like who owns that matters. And then the second that's like technologies for outpacing, like the technological development outpacing. That's it's just on track. But there's people who still don't have access to those things. And like people who still don't have. So
yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is with this like increasing privatization of like things that were once public goods,
like, you see there being opportunities for just like addressing like foundation technical gaps in access. In way, or yeah, they know they address those things, the gaps. Otherwise, it's good.
Yeah. So two questions, one about sort of ownership and the second is kind of a digital divide question. I'll take the first one. The question of who owns transcripts, I don't know the answer to that. And so that would be something that I would, investigate before I moved any further. My guess is that it probably bears some similarities to, the kinds of exceptions under which we conduct academic research. And so I don't claim to own the data that I study that's, Twitter data or Facebook data or whatever, but I can study it without fear of, legal action. And so, as a practical matter, anyone who puts any content online can't really stop it from being transcribed if it's audio data. And so I think as long as ownership isn't being claimed and as long as you are presenting, as long as it's public also, right? So if it's a government speech or something like that, there is no ownership of it. That's certainly true. So, that's copyright and intellectual property applies a little bit differently to government speech. But even if it's, speech by a private citizen, if you've made it in a public square, it's very similar to what might happen if you're a journalist quoting it, right? So would be my initial assumption there. Would be that the logic would apply similarly to automated transcription as it might be to a physical journalist who's literally writing it down on a piece of paper. Second question is about digital divide. Yeah, a lot of people don't have access to this. Folks have been working on these issues for many years, but I think that the advance of technology does have, as you say, have the capacity or the probability of accelerating these differences. And I think we just need to, like, one thing that we really need to figure out is, what are the likely impacts, and how does that change based on the amount of resources that you have, right? So, to take just one example, somebody believing that the voice of something like ChatGPT or some of the other AI-powered bots out there might be authoritative in some way, even though all the evidence strongly suggests that ChatGPT is anything but. So the ability to engage in AI literacy, right? If you're using these tools to be able to answer questions or to generate, text, or even to do something like correct for English language deficiencies of people who speak English as a second language, right? These are all things people need to be aware of. And education efforts obviously can help a lot in these areas. I believe I'm at time, so I'm going to defer to whoever is keeping that to sort of double check on that type of situation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Session, as we already scheduled, there will be one-on-one meetings with Deen just on the first floor. So I will